Welcome to another edition of the BrownsZone.com Zone Coverage Podcast. My name is Andy Barch with AM 930 WEOL and 100.3 FM. As always, joined alongside Scott Petrak, Browns beat reporter with the Chronicle, Telegram, the Medina Gazette, and of course, BrownsZone.com. Scott, great to be joined by you as always, and not a whole lot to talk about this week, is there?
No, I don't know how we're going to make the time pass today.
Yeah, it's going to be tough to get through these next 20, 30 minutes, whatever it ends up being, because boy, oh boy, is there a lot of ground to cover. You know, there's always some good, some bad, and some ugly. The good news is the Browns ended up winning, defeating the Steelers for the first time in 5 years on Thursday night. The bad? Well, I guess that's a pretty long list, and the ugly, I think that's pretty obvious with what went down at the end of the game with Myles Garrett. So let's get in to the game itself. You know, I think you hear this from a lot of people, and I know you mentioned this to Bruce Van Dyke and Craig Adams on the morning show a few days ago. Hard to celebrate a win like that because of the way that things ended. But, you know, there were a few players that took to social media to do so. A lot of people had a really big issue with that. Should we have a problem with that? I mean, these guys get how the game went down and how things ended. A win's a win, and those have been really tough to come by this year. Should we have an issue with the way those guys celebrated that?
I don't. No. I mean, you're right. The Browns haven't won many games, and this is a big game. It's still the Steelers. They're still trying to save their playoff chances. 2-0 in the division for the first time ever. Beating Pittsburgh and Baltimore in the same season for the first time ever. It's worth celebrating, and I just think it was interesting, kind of the dichotomy, where you have Baker Mayfield saying it feels like a loss, and OBJ said kind of the same thing, and Freddie Kitchens, you know, he's embarrassed, and he's never seen anything like it. And I think that was the overall tone set by the organization. And I appreciated that, and I appreciated the fact that the guys understood how egregious the acts were at the end of the game, and how that's going to mar the victory, and how the nation and the world is looking at what happened. Having said all that, I think it's okay personally to be excited you won a game. And if you're Joe Schobert, be excited you played maybe your best game ever. And maybe you earned a Pro Bowl bid because the whole nation is watching on Thursday night and you played out of your head. And maybe you earned a contract extension. And I'm just singling out Joe because I thought he played as well as I've seen him play. And those thoughts were going through my head when I'm watching him. So I have no problem with guys celebrating. I didn't see anything over the top from guys on social media. Now, I was distracted with a bunch of Myles Garrett stuff, so maybe I missed something. But, you know, and it wasn't like after the game guys weren't celebrating on the field. The mood was strange. And I've been to a lot of weird Browns games and endings, and I was at the Bottlegate, and it just had a weird feeling throughout the stadium. But I thought the guys with the biggest profiles, Freddie Kitchens, Baker Mayfield, Odell Beckham Jr., handled it well and did a good job kind of encapsulating the fact that, yeah, we won, but it's going to be overshadowed.
Sure, there's a cloud hanging over this win for sure, but see, I'm with you on that. Because you've got to celebrate wins in this league, especially for a franchise that hasn't had a whole lot to celebrate recently. And I've heard some people say that the guys who are going to social media to celebrate the win are a little tone deaf. I don't necessarily know that I agree with that because, again, it wasn't anything over the top. They weren't celebrating what happened at the end of the game. They were celebrating the fact that it was back-to-back victories, beating a team that they hadn't beaten quite some time, and knowing how emotionally invested the fan base is in beating the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Yeah, to me, that's the key difference. If the players celebrated, or even if the fans celebrated Myles Garrett's act at the end, I would have a problem with that. If they were making fun of Mason Rudolph or whatever it is, or the action, you know, saying it's okay for Myles Garrett, that would be a problem. But I think we as people and them as players can separate the win versus the final 8 seconds, and I don't have any problem with that. And, you know, when we look back at this season, yes, we're going to talk about what happened to Myles Garrett, but it is going to talk about a win. Or, you know, I mean, it is going to include a win. And when we talk about the Browns' record versus Steelers, this is going to count. And, yes, it was Baker Mayfield's first win against the Steelers, which I made a mental note about 6 times, and I'm not sure I've written that sentence yet. But it was. He got his first win against the Steelers, and that's important when you're a Browns quarterback. So I think this is such a serious topic that it has a whole lot of layers, and we can focus on a bunch of different topics because, yes, there was a game played before what happened at the end.
And we're certainly going to touch on the last 8 seconds. That's something I don't think we're going to be able to avoid on today's show. Well, let's get into how much the debacle at the end really kind of took away from the win itself. As you just mentioned, look, at the end of the year, this still counts as a victory regardless of how things ended. But, there's something to be said for momentum. After beating a team like the Steelers and, again, 2 straight wins after losing 4 in a row. So how much did the debacle, in your mind, take away from the win itself?
Well, a lot. I mean, a ton, because that would have been the focus of the weekend, is the Browns may have saved their playoff chances. And that fact hasn't changed, but we didn't spend much time talking about it. It was all Myles Garrett, and it was all Larry Ogunjobi, and it was Mason Rudolph. And, I mean, everybody knows the conversation that was had, and it was natural. And as a writer trying to figure out how to prioritize things and how to cover it, I felt at least, when's it okay to go back to football? And the story I wrote after the game, included the win, and maybe I might have thrown a couple of stats in there. And part of that's because it's deadline pressure, and you're trying to rewrite, and you had written your running gamer, as we call it, just the play-by-play of the game, and then you try to rewrite that with the quotes at the end, and it was obviously a crazy scene at the end and a crazy trying to hit deadline and a lot of stuff going on. But then the next day, even when you're talking to Freddie Kitchen on the conference call, it's like, do we need to ask him football questions? Should we ask him football questions? Because this is such a big deal, and it's unprecedented, right? I mean, by then we knew the suspension. An indefinite suspension for one on-field incident is unprecedented. It's the biggest in NFL history. It had been the 5 games for Albert Haynesworth back in, 2006 or 9. That's something I struggle with as a writer. Okay, when's it okay to flip that switch? And for me, I wound up doing it Saturday, and I went back and I wrote my breakdown of the game, which I usually do right after the game, but it hadn't gotten around to it. It didn't feel pertinent at the time, and that's when I did my thumbs up for Joe Schobert and play of the game and those kind of things, because I do think it's important to go back and look at it, and I think fans and readers care about what happened in the game. They were interested in the game. That's why they watched it for 3 hours. So I think you just have to have a balance there. But to answer the question, it took away from it a ton. And then you have the fallout, which includes not having your best defensive player likely for the rest of the season. We don't know if it'll change on appeal, but likely won't have Myles Garrett for the rest of the season. And then I also think it's fair to wonder how this team will deal with all of this. And it's not just missing Myles Garrett. It's the fallout, and it's the coverage, and it's the microscope, and it's how the team's viewed. And T.J. Carey, the cornerback, we talked to him Monday, and he got asked, hey, do you think this team's getting a reputation as being dirty? Because in addition to the end, they had 2 helmet-to-helmet hits that gave Steelers players concussions. And he said, I think we already have a reputation. And I think he meant we have all these stars, people are talking about us, maybe we're not liked, we're underachieving, like just all-encompassing. My point is they have to deal with all of this. And I'm going to be fascinated to see how that happens. I liked the responses Monday when we talked to Jarvis Landry and T.J. Carey and Sheldon Richardson. I liked where their heads were, but that doesn't mean their heads will be where they need to be Sunday against Miami and moving forward. And I think there is a psychological barrier that needs to be cleared because of how giant that event was at the end of Thursday night's game.
Let's get into the eye of that storm, because you have a lot of people on both sides of this thinking, you know what, it's garbage that Rudolph didn't get fined or suspended. There are a lot of people that are very much against the idea that he's not being punished in any way, shape, or form. And then you have some people thinking, well, was an indefinite suspension maybe a little bit too much for what Myles Garrett did? So where do you come out on all of that? Because I think when you look at this thing, you immediately think, okay, maybe he gets a little bit more than what Albert Haynesworth did. Was it worse than what Haynesworth did about 10, 15 years ago? And why is it that Rudolph kind of gets away scot-free here when it looks like, at least on film, that he was the instigator in all this.
Sure. Let's break it down. Let's start with Myles Garrett. I personally would have suspended him for 4 games. And I understand the people that say he needs to be done for the rest of the season. I get it. I get how egregious this act was. And I've been struggling for other, I don't know. I need other words to call it a brawl and to call it egregious. Because you keep coming back to the same words, but it was over the top. His action was over the top. It's not the first time a player has tried to use a helmet as a weapon, but he connected on the top of the head. It's bad. It's a bad look. It's bad that it was in prime time. I'm not sure that should affect the punishment and the penalty. I think it does. I think the NFL is all about PR, and when they see it for the world to see, when it happens for the world to see, I think that does affect the punishment. I think if it happened at 1 o'clock in a random game against Buffalo, it might not be the indefinite suspension, and I don't think that's fair. I think that's just the way of the world. So I would have given him 4 games because, to me, if you compare it to other sports, that's 40 games in baseball. And you don't see a whole lot of 40-game suspensions in baseball. And 25% of the season's a lot. So that's my opinion. I get the people that say, hey, it was so bad it needs to be the rest of the season. And I don't have a strong argument against that, except that, to me, it feels a little bit isolated with Myles Garrett, and it feels to me like 25% of the season is enough. And I don't understand the indefinite part of it. I know that that's one of the things Myles is going to try to appeal on, is that nowhere in the CBA does it say indefinite suspension. Now, I went through the CBA and I read it, and it doesn't say anything about indefinite. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't outlaw indefinite suspensions. It just doesn't specify it. So I do think that's an interesting argument that he will make. I don't think it needs a stretch into next season. I know there's people that disagree with me. That feels too much to me. On the appeal, he's going to appeal Wednesday morning. We'll probably have the ruling Thursday. If they reduced it to 6 games in a possible playoffs, maybe that's fair. I could see that happening. I don't like the indefinite part of it. So anyway, I would have given Myles Garrett 4 games. For Mason Rudolph, I would not have suspended him. He will get fined, and he'll probably get fined heftily, and it could be multiple reasons for the fine. Trying to pull the helmet off, the foot in the groin, chasing after Myles. All those things he could get separate fines for. But I think it's an interesting argument when you talk to a guy like Sheldon Richardson yesterday, the Browns defensive tackle. To me, he encapsulated what a lot of fans were thinking, and that's Rudolph antagonized Garrett. He said, you can't claim a bully, and because Rudolph claimed that Myles Garrett acted like a bully, and Richardson, hey, you can't do what you did and then claim a guy was a bully. He kind of had it coming to him, and I don't have the quote exactly right, but that's what the crux of it was, is that you can't do what you did and then pretend like you don't deserve what's coming to you. And I'm reading the quote now. You can't antagonize a fight and then claim bully after getting what's coming to you. So I think that's one way to look at it. I would say that no matter what Mason Rudolph did, Myles Garrett did not deserve to get hit over the head with his own helmet. I don't care what Mason Rudolph did. So I think you can look at things separately. You can look at what Mason Rudolph did, and it wasn't right. But then what Myles Garrett did, there's no excuse for what Myles Garrett did. And I don't think there's really extenuating circumstances for what Myles Garrett did. But just looking at Rudolph, trying to rip off a guy's helmet, to me, is not a suspension. Trying to push off Myles Garrett with your foot in his groin isn't a suspension. Chasing after him isn't a suspension. So I get that he escalated the fight, but I think if you just look at what he did, I don't think they rise to suspension level, which is why I would go Garrett 4, Rudolph none. But you think differently, don't you, Andy?
Yes. Simply because I think anytime you kick another man in his groin, you should serve some kind of suspension. Now, I think this is a different incident altogether in that when you see that there are 2 guilty parties, I think some sort of punishment needs to be levied in both directions. I think we could sit here and argue all day long about Myles Garrett, whether 4 games is enough or correct me if I'm wrong, but if this is an indefinite suspension that lasts to the rest of the regular season, it'll end up costing him 6 games. Is that right?
At least 6. Yeah, at least 6.
So I think I'm okay with that. But, when you take a look at the way that whole thing went down, I think Rudolph deserves some kind of punishment, whether that's a fine or a suspension, because, certainly there was some grappling going on when he was taken to the turf, and who knows what was said. But again, when you kick a man at his groin, I think that some sort of suspension should definitely be at play there, because that may have been the gasoline poured on the ground per se, or maybe that was the match that started the whole fire. And even though the referees may not necessarily catch the one who throws the first punch, a lot of times they catch the second one that's thrown. In this instance, the NFL has had an opportunity to go back and take a look at all the film. I just don't see how you could ignore the fact that he put his foot right in his groin.
Yeah, it's interesting. And, I studied that tape. By the time, I think I got around to really studying it about 3 a.m. Friday morning, and then I've watched it a ton of times since then. Maybe we're splitting hairs here. He doesn't really kick him in the groin. He's got his foot in there and pushes him away, right? Because he can't get Myles off him. So I think there is a slight difference there, right? Not that either of them are great, but I think there's a slight difference. I understand your point about the gasoline to the fire, and I'm not going to argue with you. I agree with that. And what I thought was interesting is Troy Vincent, the head of football operations, talked to Jason La Canfora of CBS over the weekend, and when he cited Larry Ogunjobi's 1-game suspension and Marquise Pouncey's 3-game suspension for the Steelers, he cited escalating the fight, right? It could have died down, and these guys did stuff that either did escalate it or had the potential to escalate it, right? Ogunjobi shoves Rudolph to the ground from behind. Pouncey goes crazy and is punching and kicking Garrett on the ground, and he gets to 3 games, I think deservedly so. So if you're going to take escalating into the equation, then yes, then I could understand how you could extrapolate that to Mason Rudolph and he should get a game suspension. But the other line I'm going to draw here is I felt like Myles Garrett started it. And the reason I say that is the ball is out of Rudolph's hands on a pass with 14 seconds left. And Garrett takes him down, in my opinion, late. I know some fans argued with me on Twitter. They didn't think it was late. I thought it was late. And I thought it was excessive how he took him to the ground. Borderline, you could have seen a flag for roughing the passer. So if that's the start of it, then Rudolph is reacting to that with trying to yank the helmet off and with the foot in the groin. Not that it absolves Rudolph, just like it doesn't absolve Garrett for the helmet hit. But to me, Garrett started it, and that probably changes how I view the Rudolph aspect is people who think that Rudolph started.
Fair enough. I think in most cases, Rudolph is guilty in the court of public opinion in some form or fashion, but you're right. As far as the NFL goes, it sure looks like he's been absolved of any wrongdoing, because when you don't levy any sort of punishment, they don't, at least to me, it seems like they don't think he did anything wrong.
Well, he'll be fined. I mean, because they haven't announced the fines yet, and those will come out Saturday. So he's going to be fined for a role in the fight. And my guess is it'll be $50,000, like somewhere in that ballpark. It'll be a significant fine. But if you're a Browns fan and you lose 2 of your players, and yes, Pouncey's out, but Rudolph was a central figure for the Steelers. And for him not to get a suspension, I understand how that upsets Browns fans. I understand how it upsets Sheldon Richardson and Browns players. And you got a little bit of vibe of that in the locker room Monday. Some guys didn't want anything to do with it, right? Because either they don't think he deserved a suspension or they don't want to minimize what Myles Garrett did. And it was interesting, Freddie Kitchens was asked about that. And he was asked a couple times over the weekend and then on Monday about, did Rudolph deserve a suspension? Did he provoke Myles? And Freddie was saying, you guys seen the tape. I'm not going to say my opinion, but you guys have seen the tape. And there was a little counter from reporters to Freddie, like, well, are you trying to are you saying Myles had a reason for doing what he did? And that's when Freddie said, I'm not giving Myles any excuse, because what Myles did was inexcusable, to use Baker Mayfield's word right after the game. So to me, that's the way to look at it. Is you can say Rudolph provoked it, you can say Rudolph deserved this, but that doesn't absolve Myles Garrett. It doesn't excuse Myles Garrett, and I think that's the way to look at it. At least that's my opinion. Is if you take a step back, nothing Mason Rudolph did makes what Myles Garrett did okay.
And moving forward, the way that this will affect the team, I think, is tremendous for all the wrong reasons. Because, when we were doing these, Scott, back in July and early August, we were talking during training camp about how this defensive line was going to be one of the primary strengths of this team. Now you're not going to have the best player on that unit, and you could argue physically might be the best player on this team. I mean, that's a debate for a different show, but Olivier Vernon, I mean, he's been dinged up throughout the course of the year, and there are reports that he may or may not return the next couple weeks here too. So those are your two starting defensive ends, right, going into the beginning of the season. So you could be looking at a scenario the next couple of weeks here where you don't have either one of those guys. So how does this affect them moving forward? Well,
it's huge. And don't forget Larry Ogunjobi is right now suspended for the Miami game. His appeal was heard Monday. We'll probably get we're taping this Tuesday. We'll probably get a ruling on the appeal sometime Tuesday, maybe early Wednesday. But let's assume he's out. Then you lose. Then 3 of your 4 starting linemen could be out. Freddie said Vernon will be close to playing Sunday, but he hasn't played in 2 weeks. He probably won't be 100%. So you're really shorthanded at, like you mentioned, a position of strength, and maybe the biggest position of strength on the team. I mean, Freddie Kitchens was saying that in training camp. So it's huge. And specifically the loss of Myles Garrett, and I'm looking forward to asking defensive coordinator Steve Wilkes about this on Thursday. If you're a game planner, if you're Steve Wilkes or you're the opposing offensive coordinator, that changes everything, right? Because Myles Garrett's a guy that gets double-teamed a bunch. So that means probably a tight end doesn't go out in a route. All of a sudden, if the opposing offense thinks it can block your 4 guys with its 5 guys, then 5 guys are out in routes, and it changes your coverage schemes. On the other hand, if you're Steve Wilkes and you say, you know what, I got Garrett, Vernon, Ogunjobi, and Richardson, I can go get to this quarterback with 4 guys and drop 7, all of a sudden you're looking, well, I got Chad Thomas, Chris Smith, I still got Richardson, and then I got Devereaux Lawrence. And this isn't a knock on those guys, but as coaches like to say, people are starters for a reason. All of a sudden you're like, I don't trust that I'm going to get home with my 4 guys. So I got to bring a linebacker, I got to bring a safety, I got to bring a corner. All of a sudden you can only cover with 5 or 6. And all of a sudden you're covering 5 or 6 versus 5 and 6. It just changes the whole landscape. And I think that's going to be huge. We might not see the effect against the Dolphins because the Dolphins are the Dolphins. But they're going back to Pittsburgh. They're going to host the Ravens, who are the hottest team in football, arguably. They go to play Kyler Murray in Arizona. I think just on the football field, the loss of Myles Garrett is huge. Now, they should get Vernon back at some point. It might even be Sunday. They will get Larry Ogunjobi back, and that helps. But just even losing a guy like Myles Garrett with all his physical tools changes a defense. I mean, that's why you draft him number 1 overall, right? I mean, those guys change a defense, and the Browns are going to have to get better play from the 11 guys, and their offense is going to have to play better, right? I mean, they're probably not going to win a whole lot of 21-7 games anymore. And it's tough to think how one guy affects a team. And I don't know if the Vegas lines change at all because Myles Garrett's not in there, but I think the over/under maybe should change because it just seems natural to me that the Browns will give up more points without Myles Garrett on the field.
We'll come around to that Miami game here in just a moment, but really kind of lost in the mix with all that went down at the end of the game on Thursday night. Baker Mayfield shows some serious maturity at the end of the game, and I know you mentioned you were very, very impressed with the way, not only the way he handled everything, but the way that he played against a very tough Steelers defense on Thursday night. You think he's turned a corner here these last couple weeks?
I do, and I'm not one to usually get ahead of myself, but I feel that way about Baker because it's been 3 games in a row, right? Denver, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, without a turnover. That's huge for him. Now, he threw a couple balls in that there that could have been intercepted. One against Denver jumps out. One against Buffalo is a bad throw in a double coverage. It gets dropped. But that's okay. That happens, right? Quarterbacks get a break every once in a while. I thought against Pittsburgh, he reminded me of Baker as a rookie, especially in one aspect to me that's huge. Pittsburgh brings pressure. And T.J. Watt's a really good player. Bud Dupree is a good player. Cameron Hayward in the middle is a good player. And the Browns' line held up for the most part, but there were leaks. Like, there's going to be leaks against the front like that. And Baker found ways to navigate in the pocket, to buy time. Whether he stayed in the pocket, stepped up, whether he got outside a little bit, and then made throws. And it reminded me of plays Baker made all last year and had been missing. Right early in the season, we talked so much about him rolling out premature, right? He was bailing out to the right. And then he would run into a sack every once in a while. Like, he just didn't have that innate pocket awareness that I thought separated him from his peers as a rookie. And I saw that in perfect form, in my estimation, against Pittsburgh. And that's what impressed me the most. And I think it was most evident on two huge plays in the game. The 40-yard throw to Kaderil Hodge. He steps up, a little-known receiver breaks loose, and he hits him down the right sideline. And then the touchdown that finally sealed the game, right? They'd had 95 opportunities to end the game, and they couldn't capitalize. And I'm exaggerating with 95. But they had opportunity after opportunity to end the game, and they couldn't score. And finally, Joe Schobert interception takes it to the 4-yard line. All of a sudden, the Browns are facing 3rd and 8. And a field goal probably wins the game because it puts them up by 10 with 5 minutes left. And I'm sitting there in the press box going, Baker, what are you doing? Because he's running around and he's buying time. I'm just throw the ball away, kick the field goal, game's over. But not only does he buy time, he sets his feet, scans the field, and finds a matchup where the linebacker doesn't see the ball coming. He's got his back to the ball and makes a great throw to unknown tight end Stephen Carlson, an undrafted rookie out of Princeton, who makes a great catch on the other end. And talk about things that get lost in the win or lost in the outcome or the final 8 seconds is Stephen Carlson. But to me, that was vintage Baker. Buying time, setting his feet, throwing a dart, and seeing the whole field, knowing that was a safe enough throw to make, even though there were bodies around. Where he threw it, there weren't. There were two guys, and his guy had eyes on the ball coming. So those two plays to me said, yeah, maybe Baker has turned that corner. And as far as what he said after the game, I do think that was a sign of maturity, calling it inexcusable and not dodging the questions. And obviously Baker doesn't pull punches, right? He's not the cookie-cutter quarterback. And that's how he felt. And he has a relationship with Mason Rudolph, and maybe that factored into it. They played against each other at Oklahoma State. And he's a quarterback, so no quarterback wants to see a quarterback get hit over the head. Like, all those things probably factored in. But I did think Baker set the right tone and had the right message. While saying that, and I'd like your opinion on this, I also thought, is that going to go over great with his teammates? Are there teammates that say, hey, in the minutes after this all went down, because it was minutes after, maybe you should not pile on Myles Garrett. Maybe you should back your teammate. Now, I'm fine with Baker speaking the truth, and I agree with him, but I do wonder if that sentiment would bother anybody inside that locker room.
Potentially, but at the same time, I think you have a lot of guys that were thinking the same way. In that, that's where you really kind of find out where the true leaders are. I mean, it's easy to sit there and just back your teammate, but you also have to go into this thing with the thinking of, you know what, he was wrong. What he did wasn't right. You can't justify your teammate taking the other guy's helmet off and hitting him over the head with it. And, that's a game of emotion, right? Sometimes you have to keep your emotions in check and let cooler heads prevail. And those comments after the game told me, wow, you know what? I think it would be easy for us to sit here and say he should still be fired up and back his teammate, but he had the wherewithal to calm things down in a post-game press conference and say, you know what? He was wrong. Inexcusable. No spot for that in the game. And that told me maybe he is possibly turning the corner. And I think there are a lot of other guys in the locker room that were probably thinking the same thing that he was saying. They all love Myles Garrett. He's their teammate, whole 9 yards. But I don't necessarily think that they would have taken that as piling on. But they also know that if the quarterback says it, sometimes that's got a trickle-down effect. So it's interesting to see what kind of effect that might have. But I think Myles Garrett will tell you to a man, too, yeah, you know what? I acted out of turn, and he has since apologized to his teammates. So I think if Myles Garrett had taken exception to it, then maybe you'd see that thing start to blow up. But I think he would tell you also, look, it was inexcusable. I just acted out of character.
No, I think that's really well said. And the fact that he's a quarterback, you do want him to set that tone, and you want him to lead. And I thought it was interesting. He did an interview before the game that I finally got around to watching, and he talked about maybe not being himself as much as he should have early in the year because he was kind of tiptoeing around the Odell Beckham, Jarvis Landry, just having these big personalities. And Baker was like, I was a little cautious. I didn't communicate as much. And I think what he means is I wasn't as strict with, you guys have to do this. Be on point. We can't have any of these mistakes. And I think Baker's kind of finding himself more on the field and off the field. And as long as it's in the right way, that's exactly what you need your quarterback to be.
And they need him to do that again. They need him to show some leadership and step up again against the Dolphins on Sunday. I get it. The Dolphins aren't having a great year, but look, the way things went down at the end of Thursday's game, you just hope that that doesn't have a residual effect. Now, they'll have 10 days between games, and we'll close out on this, Scott. Your thoughts about this game coming up on Sunday, because even though the Dolphins aren't having the greatest of seasons, should there be any concern about this game? On paper, the Browns should win this thing by a couple of scores.
I think there is reason to be concerned. The line I saw today was 10.5, which is a big line. It's a little bigger than I thought it would be. The Browns haven't blown out anybody. They won by 15 in Baltimore. They beat the Steelers by 14. Those are kind of outliers, right? They played a lot of close games or been blown out. But I get it. But the fact is the Dolphins had won 2 in a row before they lost to Buffalo on Sunday, which means they're not in full tanking mode. Maybe the organization is, the players and coach aren't. I expect them to play hard. They have played hard, even in the losing, right? And I think that's a testament to their first-year coach, Brian Flores. The Browns can't overlook this. But like I talked about earlier, to me, it's all mental. It's how does this team cope with it, and do they bring the focus after what happened Thursday night, after knowing what the Dolphins' record is? You look ahead to the rematch with the Steelers the following Sunday in Pittsburgh. All these are factors, and it's going to be a challenge for Freddie Kitchens to get his guys ready to play. Now, maybe the Myles Garrett incident brings everybody together, and maybe that's a turning point in the season, and that sharpens their focus. But until I see it Sunday, I'll have concern about whether or not it sharpened their focus. I think on the field, the Browns are the better team. With Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb and Baker playing better and Odell. They should score points. Jarvis Landry is going to be motivated out of his head playing his former team. Ryan Fitzpatrick at quarterback can put up points. He can also turn it over a ton. So the Browns are going to have to be careful there. But they're the better team, and they should win, and it should be a quote-unquote easy win. But there's reasons to worry, and I've stated a lot of them, and the final one is you could be missing most of your starting defensive line.
Yeah, I think that's the major concern. You're not really sure which team you're bringing in on Sunday against the Dolphins. Scott, as always, a pleasure. This was a lot of fun. There was a lot to talk about today, and hopefully we'll have plenty to discuss next week as well. But we'll do that again next week.
Sounds good. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Scott. Again, Scott Petrak with the Chronicle, Telegram, Medina Gazette, and, of course, BrownsZone.com. That'll put a wrap on this week's edition of the BrownsZone.com Zone Coverage Podcast. For Scott Petrak, this is Andy Barch saying thank you for listening. We'll catch you again next week.